In our last lesson, we learned about how important a role cultural aspects like language, like history, like myths, like folk tales, like folklores played in spreading nationalistic sentiments among the masses. Now, in the first few decades of the 19th century, Europe was embroiled in several kinds of instabilities. Firstly, after the French Revolution, the foundation of most of the political systems of different territorial units in Europe were shaken, because the French Revolution was not just about a change in a government system. It was a whole lot of changes that this French Revolution entailed. And people were now in a state of unrest. They were no longer willing to remain in the political systems that continued to govern and oppress them for many centuries. Now, along with this political instability, economic instability was another thing that Europe in the first decades of the 19th century was embroiled in. So let us now look into the reasons why Europe was severely enmeshed in economic hardship during this time. During the first few decades of the 19th century, population was on the rise in most of the European regions. Now, this rising population created a lot of consequent issues, one among which would be increasing unemployment. Why is it so? Because there was a scarcity of jobs, scarcity of employment for all these people. Now, many of these people were migrating from the villages or the rural areas to the urban spaces in search of employment. And there was not sufficient employment, sufficient number of jobs to employ these people, which is why people were now poverty-stricken in the urban spaces. At the same time, slums also started growing up because housing facilities were not available for all these people who migrated to the urban spaces. So these were the most obvious repercussions of the rising population. At the same time, the various industries, the various artisans were facing a stiff competition from the machine-made goods of England. Now, the Industrial Revolution's impact was most palpable and evident in England in the first few decades of the 19th century, because it was in England that the Industrial Revolution had spread its influence very rapidly. And so many machine-made goods were available there. And these goods were very cheap in price. And these were exported to the surrounding European places. And in those European regions, the native artisans, the native craftspersons found it difficult to compete with the cheap machine-made goods of England. As a result of this, many artisans, many craftspersons were rendered unemployed. And then food prices also began to rise. Now, why do you think did food prices suddenly begin to rise? This was because of bad harvest. Now, whenever the harvest was bad, whenever the crops failed, the peasants were the worst hit of these issues. So the peasants were already struggling in order to earn a living. They were not able to feed themselves properly. And whenever these crops failed, there wasn't sufficient food grains to feed the ever-rising population. So as a result of this, there was food shortages and scarcity of food, and increase in demand now gave birth to rise in food prices. And these people who were already being rendered unemployed because of a whole lot of reasons, or these people who were not finding employment in the urban spaces, found it very, very difficult to buy food products in very high prices. And then feudal dues and obligations made the lives of the peasants even more difficult than it already was. So together, all this host of reasons contributed to great economic hardship in Europe in the 1830s. Now, during this time, the workers, the traders of various places were filled with discontentment. Because the workers, the craftspersons in various industries, in various small mills, were not paid as much as they should have been. They were forced to render labor for very low wages in most of the cases. And this was also the case in Silesia. Now, Silesia is a region that spans across major parts of Poland and small parts of Czech Republic and Germany. Now, in this place called Silesia, the weavers were filled with discontentment and anger against the contractor who forced them to produce finished goods at very, very low prices. So these weavers of Silesia were not paid well, and they were having to work for very long hours. So on June 4, 1845 at around 2 p.m. these people, as in these weavers of Silesia, now revolted against their contractor. They were demanding higher wages because they found it very difficult to meet their everyday expenses, and at the same time it was also injustice because these people were having to work a lot, and in return for the same they were receiving very low to no wages at all. And so these people now started revolting. They in fact entered the house of this contractor. So the huge mansion of this contractor was vandalized, the windows and the doors were broken. In fact, the threads which were stored in the looms of this contractor were also destroyed. Now at this juncture, the contractor found it very difficult to suppress the revolt. He had to flee with his family because his life was at risk. But while fleeing, this contractor brought in the army for suppressing the revolt. And the army managed to suppress the revolt of the weavers of Silesia. So in many local regions, people were breaking out in rebellions, people were breaking out in small revolts because of their oppressed lives, because of how difficult their lives had become in the first few decades of the 19th century. Likewise, in France as well, people were no longer happy with the constitutional monarchy. In our last lesson, we talked about how it was the July Revolution of 1830 that had instituted constitutional monarchy in France, and Louis Philippe became the new head of the government. But in France as well, people were finding it very difficult to meet the rising living expenses. Most of the people were unemployed, they were hungry, they were poverty stricken, and in a case like this, the population of Paris now came out on the streets in 1848, and they were shouting in protest against the monarch. As a result of this, Louis Philippe was forced to flee. So constitutional monarchy failed to restore calm and stability in France following the July Revolution of 1830. As a result of Louis Philippe losing his power over France, a national assembly now proclaimed France as a republic. So this was another step taken forwards to the achievement of liberty, because in a republican form of government, people get to choose their own representatives. So a republican government is very different from a monarchical setup in which the monarch holds absolute power over the people. So now France was proclaimed a republic, and then universal adult franchise was introduced. So all French males above 21 years of age were now given voting rights, and then national workshops were also set up in order to provide employment to these unemployed people, to these poverty-stricken people. So what we can infer from this is that Europe in the first few decades of the 19th century was caught up in a series of changes and transitions, and all these things were happening because of the spirit of nationalism, because of the feeling of rage and anger against the oppression and injustice meted out to the common masses. In parts of Europe where independent nation states were not established as yet, people also took to the streets to voice their opinions. So in places like Germany, Italy, Poland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, men and women now broke out in rebellion and protests and demonstrations. So people were marching on the streets. And what were their demands? Their demands were constitutionalism with national unification. Now, these places like Italy, the Confederation of the Rhine, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or even Poland were divided into several principalities or states. And these principalities or states were not united. So in order to establish a common governance, it was very important to achieve national unification. But this national unification would remain incomplete without establishing constitutionalism, because it is only a constitution that could give people their rights, that could ensure individual liberty, that could ensure people's equality before the law. So during this time, that is from 1848 to 1849, revolutions were breaking out in local pockets as well as in major pockets throughout these places in Europe. We know that Napoleon had joined the 39 principalities or states to together make up the German Confederation or Confederation of the Rhine. Now, these states did not have any uniform system of governance. There was no one central administration, no uniform set of laws. All these states had their own currencies and they were living with their own rules and regulations. So, national unification was very crucial to hold all these states together. Now, in the German regions, a large number of political associations came together in the city of Frankfurt. So, in Frankfurt, a huge number of political associations now came together. And what did they demand? They now decided to vote for an all-German National Assembly. One National Assembly which would take care of Germany as a whole and not these states individually. Before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. In which city was the all-German National Assembly convened? Was it convened in Vienna, Frankfurt, Mainz or Berlin? Well, the correct answer is Frankfurt. Members from several political associations came together in Frankfurt to convene the all-German National Assembly, an assembly which would take care of the interests of this entire nation called Germany. But for this, it was important to establish a new nation state of Germany. So, it was on May 18, 1848 that 831 elected representatives now marched in a festive procession to the Frankfurt Parliament, and this Frankfurt Parliament was convened in the Church of St. Paul. So here you can see how the 831 elected representatives had assembled at the Frankfurt Parliament on May 18, 1848 to discuss about German unification. When they were planning on the course of action, as in what the fate of Germany would be, they now drafted a constitution for a German nation, and this German nation was to be headed by a monarchy that was subject to a parliament. So a monarch would be at the head or at the helm of this new German nation as this constitution stated, but it was to be subject to a parliament so that the monarch's powers could be checked and balanced by this parliament. At this point of time, all the rulers, the conservative rulers to be specific, were apprehensive of the power that this Frankfurt Assembly could yield in the political sphere. And so they had to crush these rebels. They had to suppress them altogether so as to ensure the continuation of autocratic and conservative rules. Now when these rebels or when these members of the Frankfurt Assembly proposed this idea of a monarchy that was subject to a parliament to Friedrich Wilhelm IV, who was the king of Prussia, he instantaneously rejected this proposal because he knew that he had to suppress this revolt altogether. He could not give people the power to voice their opinions, to overthrow the conservative rule. And likewise, conservative rulers from the neighboring regions also started supporting Friedrich Wilhelm IV in his attempt to suppress this rebellion. And over the years, this rebellion was also corroded. This parliament could not achieve anything great. This is because this Frankfurt Assembly was constituted by the middle class members, by the propertied wealthy people. They did not take into account the interests of the artisans, the poor, the peasants, the ones who did not have access to wealth. And so those members who did not really find any representation in this Frankfurt Assembly most definitely did not support the cause of this Frankfurt Assembly, because this Frankfurt Assembly would have been the rule of just another section of propertied men. And so this Frankfurt Assembly over the years was completely disbanded, and Friedrich Wilhelm IV, who was the king of Prussia, managed to suppress this rebellion at this point of time. Now, though revolutions like the one we just saw in the case of Germany were breaking out in several parts of Europe, the contributions of these revolutions remained limited initially, because these revolutions did not take into account one half of the population, and that were the women. Though women actively took part in the revolution, they went out on the streets, they formed their own associations to form new nation states, the liberal movements were quite hesitant about granting political rights to women. So women were not given their franchise rights. Their franchise rights, their political rights were rejected. So how could these movements, these revolutions be successful without incorporating one half of the population? And these revolutions were doomed to failure almost inevitably. So women, along with being denied suffragette rights, were considered mere outsiders. In fact, in the Frankfurt Assembly, women were allowed to enter only as observers. So they were supposed to be in the gallery in this Frankfurt Assembly. They were not to be a part of this discussion, a part of how the fate of Germany was to take a new shape. So members of the lower classes like the artisans, the workers, were given no representation and recognition by this new assembly. And without incorporating these people into the fabric of this revolution, it was doomed to fail. With this, we come to an end of our discussion on the age of revolutions in Europe from 1830 to 1848. In the course of our last couple of lessons, we saw how the spirit of nationalism, together with the ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity, enthused the people, gave people the confidence to wage their own revolutions against the autocratic conservative governments. Now, in these cases, most of these revolutions did not really succeed in overthrowing the governments completely, because conservative regimes managed to suppress these revolts. In cases more than one, the conservative governments still came back to power. Though monarchy was challenged, but it was not completely overthrown at this point of time. And you'll be surprised to know that in the subsequent decades, the spirit of nationalism was relied upon by the autocratic conservative rulers in order to perpetuate their rule. Well, it sounds so ironical, because it was this one spirit of nationalism with which people thought that they could overthrow the conservative rules. Well, the thing was that these conservative rulers also used the spirit of nationalism in order to control and suppress the people. Well, this is a discussion that we will be taking up in our subsequent lessons. In our next lesson, we will be focusing on how unification took place in Germany in the middle of the 19th century. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.